Hey Boat Dragons, welcome back to my channel. I'm really glad you joined me today. I'm going to be talking about adaptations today. And specifically, I'm going to try to answer the question, to the best of my ability, and to the extent of my opinion only, do adaptations of books need to be exact? A lot of people are very critical about adaptations. I've been critical myself of certain adaptations. And I think a lot of it comes from a desire to see the stories that we know so well and love so well be treated fairly when they get on the big screen or on the small screen. And so I wanted to tackle this subject, and just know, again, this is my opinion. I am not trying to tell you how to think about adaptations that you've seen, just my personal feelings on it. And I think probably the most obvious starting point for this is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, directed by Peter Jackson. That seems to be the gold standard of where we can really start to say, man, that was a great adaptation. I don't know any fan of the Lord of the Rings book that absolutely hates the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There are some detractors for sure. There are people that like some things and they don't like others, but overall it was very well received by fans and non-book readers alike. And I think that's kind of what we want to do, right? We want to attract people who've never read the books to the story, and maybe they'll end up even reading the book afterward. And for me personally, that's what happened to me. It's not that I didn't like to read. I had just never read The Lord of the Rings until I saw the first movie, Fellowship of the Ring, in the theaters, and I'm like, okay, I have to read the book before the other two movies come out. And I did. I read the entire book over the span of a summer, because it's a long book. It's a bit detailed. So I read the entire book over a summer, and I absolutely loved it. And that gave me some insight into what I might be looking for in the next two movies. And so when I went into those movies, I did go in with a little bit more of a critical eye, but I still really, really enjoyed the movies overall. They were just fantastic, and they really are the gold standard even for me as to what a good adaptation should look like. But there were things that they changed, right? There were things that they left out. They kind of had to. You can't really put The Lord of the Rings into 3 movies. Even extended cuts, which is the only cut that's worth watching. And again, that's my opinion, but it's a very accurate opinion, if I might say so. And most fans will agree with me, I think, on that point. But, there's just so much that you can do in a visual medium that there are going to be things that are left out, right? So we come to expect that. And I think a lot of people who loved the Lord of the Rings trilogy of movies, when The Hobbit got announced, were really expecting about that same level of care for the story. And then when it was announced that it was going to be 3 movies instead of 2, we're like, oh, really? Okay, what are you going to do with that? And so, for me personally, when I saw the Hobbit movies in the theater, because I'd read the book at least twice, maybe even 3 times at that point, because I read it with my kids and things. It was a very beloved story for me. And Smaug is one of my favorite dragons in all of fantasy fiction. So I had a lot of buy-in going into these movies, and I'm like, I hope they do it good. I hope they do it good. I hope it's the same. And I have to say, in my personal opinion, again, most of it was exactly what I wanted. There were things that were added. There were things that were changed. It didn't need to be 3 movies, in my personal opinion. There was way too much CGI. But I had a lot of fun with it. I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. They nailed Smaug perfectly. I wasn't super unhappy with the movies at all. Are there things that I wish they might not have changed? Sure, yeah, there's plenty of those. But overall, I really think it was excellently done. I think kind of what I'm driving at here is going into adaptations with the understanding that it's a different medium. It can't be perfect. It can't be a one-for-one adaptation in a lot of respects because a lot of things depend upon budget and cinematography styles and the artists that are working in the movie. It's a well-oiled machine, and there's just some things that aren't necessarily going to translate well to the visual medium. And so I kind of go into adaptations knowing that it's going to be more like fan fiction. Now, not necessarily. It's not somebody going in and completely telling their own version and additional tales in the world. They're actually adapting the original story, so it's not necessarily fan fiction, but it is people who love the books that are trying to make the adaptation, so there's a sense in which it is fan fiction. I go into these movies expecting a really good fantasy story that happens to take place in one of my favorite worlds. And it doesn't always come off well, right? It doesn't always work. But when it does, it's amazing. One of the ones that didn't really work for me was the Shannara Chronicles, based on the Shannara novels by Terry Brooks. It wasn't great for me. It was fun. It was entertaining. But that was one of those adaptations where I was like, wow, they just made this an almost completely different story. I kind of knew when I heard it was going to be championed by MTV and some studios that I really hadn't heard of. I'm like, wow, okay, I'm a little bit worried here. But they did nail some things. They really captured the spirit of the Shannara books, I think. So I have to be happy with that. I have to be glad that they captured the spirit of it, and they brought a lot of new readers to the Shannara books, which nobody can turn a blind eye to that. We want more people to read books. I say at the end of every one of my videos, don't I? I say, read more books. And that's what we want. We want more people to read the books that we love. So I wasn't super happy with how they pulled off the Shannara Chronicles. They nailed Al-Anon. I'll say that much. I thought Manu Bennett was a fantastic choice for Al-Anon, and he was great. But for the most part, it wasn't great for me. But that's okay. A lot of people loved it, and a lot of people started reading Shannara as a result of it, so I am not going to complain. I even think that sometimes adaptations are better than the books. One case in point is the Bourne movies, Jason Bourne, The Bourne Identity, The Bourne Supremacy, The Bourne Ultimatum. I personally think those movies were way better than the books. And granted, I had watched the Bourne movies several times and fallen in love with them before I ever read one of the books by Robert Ludlum. The first book I read was, of course, The Bourne Identity. I'm like, hey, I'm going to check this out and see how it compares. Because I do like to read the books that the movies are based on. And so I read the first book, and it was okay. The ending was pretty good for me, but it did not age well. And then I got halfway through the Bourne Supremacy and I DNF'd it. I'm like, this is just not what I want to be reading. And so that's one of the cases where I think the adaptation is probably as far as I'm going to go with that story. I think it was a whole lot better than the books. You can disagree with me. Please feel free to disagree with me. The books just didn't work for me. And you might be out there saying, oh, Chaz, you spoiled yourself by watching the movies first. Maybe I did. But I like what I like. And I just happen to like the movies better. We've had some really great adaptations that have come out in the last few years, one of which is His Dark Materials, based on the books by Philip Pullman. And that was on HBO, and I thought it was very, very well done. I was really pleased with it. There was a movie way back in the day that we just don't really acknowledge based on the first book, and it was not great. But the trilogy of TV series on HBO was magnificent. Did they change things? Sure. I thought it was one of the best adaptations that I have seen in a long time. And then, of course, we got Good Omens, which I think Good Omens is the modern gold standard for adaptations, especially TV adaptations, because it followed the book almost exactly. Sure, there were some changes, but overall, it was almost a carbon copy of the book. I think that's what a lot of readers get upset about, is that their books were not carbon copied to the screen. And I get that. I appreciate that perspective. And sometimes it's not easily doable. In the case of Good Omens, it came off flawlessly. And I was so happy with the end result. I've watched it several times since my first watch through, and I absolutely love Good Omens. They nailed the characters so perfectly, so I couldn't be happier with that one. And I think a lot of fans of Good Omens feel the same way. I would say probably the majority of Good Omens fans feel that way. But then there's other adaptations that I take more of a controversial viewpoint on than a lot of people do. One of those is Foundation by Isaac Asimov. The Apple TV series, based on those books, made a lot of changes. I mean, significant changes. But I think it worked. I think it worked for the medium that they're trying to portray, because the Foundation books, and I've only read the first book, so don't take my word as gospel on this. The story in the first Foundation book was very, very sparse. It was really, really plot driven. There wasn't a lot of meat and potatoes. It was just kind of a bare bones story, which is fine. I enjoyed it. It didn't blow me away, but I enjoyed it. I think a story like that, if you're going to adapt it well, you have to make changes. You have to fill in the gaps that were very glaring in the story. And so I've really enjoyed the first 2 seasons of Foundation, and I'm really excited to see where they go. There may be several fans out there that really didn't like what they did with it, but I personally think that it stuck to the spirit of what Asimov created, and I'm very much excited to see where it goes from here. And so I think the last one I want to touch on for this subject is probably pretty obvious, and that's The Rings of Power on Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime's adaptations have been kind of hit or miss. They gave us Good Omens, which was awesome. They gave us Wheel of Time, which I actually really, really like. But I DNF'd the series, and so I'm just kind of watching the show now and really enjoying it. I'm sure it's a far cry from the books, but that's okay. I'd rather watch that than read a 15-book series. That's just me personally. But when it comes to Rings of Power, that one is really controversial, because you are taking a world that is beloved by fans worldwide and trying to create something based on very little information. And so my personal opinion is that The Rings of Power is a really great adaptation for what information they have to work with. You got to understand that Amazon was not granted the rights to the Silmarillion, which is the Bible for the Second Age of Middle-earth. That's where you're going to get tons of information about the characters that are presented. Yeah, they're presented in smaller form in the appendices of Lord of the Rings, and that's the only thing that they were given access to by the Tolkien estate. So they can only do so much. They are not allowed to touch the Silmarillion. And I think for me, that informed my decision as to whether or not I'm okay with the direction the show has taken. Now, did they take liberties outside of the appendices? Sure, I have no doubt that they did. But I really feel like they have honored Tolkien's legacy as much as they possibly can with what little they had to go on. I'm going to get a lot of flack for that. I know I am, because there's a lot of detractors out there for the Rings of Power. It didn't do well ratings-wise, I don't think, especially for Season 2. A lot of diehard Tolkien fans are not happy with it at all, and I'm probably going to be called a non-fan because of my take on it. But I just went into it expecting a great fantasy story set in the world of Middle-earth. And because I went into it with that expectation, I feel like I enjoyed it a lot more. If I sat down and nitpicked a lot of stuff, like, oh, well, this isn't right and this isn't right, I probably would have not enjoyed myself as much. And I had nitpicks, sure, but overall, I feel like they really honored the legacy that Tolkien left us. And I'm excited to see where the series goes. We got some really cool stuff in Season 2 of The Rings of Power, and I can't wait for Season 3. I really hope it does get a Season 3. They had originally planned to do 5 seasons, I think, which is probably stretching it a little bit, but I'm okay with it. I'm excited to see where it goes. Maybe we'll get a lot more offered to us that requires that many seasons, but I also don't know if it's going to get that many seasons just because the ratings haven't been good. And that's a problem with streaming services, right? If the ratings aren't there, they drop it. Amazon is pretty good about keeping the series going for a while and not just dropping it after the first season. So we'll see how that goes. I just felt like I wanted to talk about this and have this discussion because I go in with low expectations. I go in knowing that it's not going to be an exact representation of the book. And I personally don't think it has to be. Maybe you think it has to be, and that's completely fine. I appreciate the importance of portraying the story well. So yeah, if you come from the place of the adaptation has to be exact, I understand that. And I definitely resonate with that line of thinking. I recently watched the newest adaptation of Salem's Lot on HBO Max, and I was really hoping for a pretty accurate adaptation of that book because it's my favorite Stephen King book so far, and I really think that story can be told in a pretty exact manner. And I think that plays into it too, how devoted we are to a particular book can affect how we approach an adaptation as well. So I kind of went into it hoping that there would be an exact adaptation, but it wasn't. And that was okay. I had fun watching the movie. I enjoyed it, but I had my nitpicks. And I think that's the best that we can expect when we go into adaptations, is to have something given to us that represents the spirit of the book that we love so much. So yeah, that's where I stand on it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of my thoughts on adaptations. What are some of your thoughts on adaptations? I would love to dialogue with you in the comments. Feel free to disagree with me. That's completely fine. Just do it in a respectful way. And until next time, guys, make sure you read more books. I'll talk with you soon. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to my patrons. I really appreciate all the support you give my channel.